The sound that haunts me most is not shouting or slammed doors, but the delicate clink of glass, the sound of two wine stems brushing together across my own dining room table. I had gone upstairs to grab a blanket for Lily, who had fallen asleep on the couch when I paused at the landing. Below, in the golden light of the chandelier, I saw Mark lean closer toward Tessa, his hand grazing hers, in a way that was too tender, too rehearsed to be innocent. My breath caught as I watched her smile at him with a familiarity that should have belonged to me, and for a moment, the room itself seemed to tilt. That quiet gesture, so ordinary and yet so dangerous, was the first crack in the life I thought I knew. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories of betrayal and justice. My name is Elena Brooks, and I've always been the dependable one, the steady hand everyone else could lean on. I grew up in Ohio in a modest but close-knit household where my father worked 2 jobs to make sure we never missed a meal, and my mother taught me that keeping peace in the family was worth almost any sacrifice. I carried those lessons into my own marriage, believing stability and patience could hold together even the sharpest edges of love. For years, it seemed to work. Mark and I had built a home that looked enviable from the outside, a comfortable house in the suburbs, our daughter Lily thriving in school, and a circle of friends that gathered around our table for holidays and birthdays. Mark was charming in that effortless way people in sales often are. He had the smile that could soften a client's resistance, the laugh that could carry across a crowded room. Where I brought quiet order, he brought sparkle, and for a long time, I thought we balanced each other perfectly. His father, Walter, loved telling me I'd steadied Mark, given him a reason to put down roots, and I believed him. Even when Mark's late nights became more frequent, chalked up to dinners with clients or company trips, I told myself it was all part of providing for us. I was proud of him, proud of us, proud of the life we had carefully shaped over 20 years together. And then there was Tessa. She came into our lives through Lily's school fundraiser, a capable event planner with an easy laugh and a way of making herself indispensable. Before I realized it, she was everywhere at family barbecues, helping organize birthday parties, even joining us for Thanksgiving when her own family was traveling. At first, I was grateful. She was my age, understood the exhaustion of balancing teenagers and work, and seemed to admire the life Mark and I had built. I thought I had found a true friend, someone I could confide in. What I didn't see, what I didn't want to see, was the way her admiration often lingered longer on Mark than on me. Looking back, the signs were quiet but constant. A laugh that bubbled too easily at his jokes, her hand brushing his arm as she leaned in to share a story, the way her eyes followed him when she thought no one noticed. I told myself it was harmless, that she was simply warm and affectionate, that I was being paranoid. After all, Mark was mine. He had stood beside me through Lily's childhood, through sleepless nights and family holidays, through the routines that formed the glue of real marriages. Why would I question that foundation now? But the night of the wine glasses changed something. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs holding that folded blanket and realized how easily small gestures could become secrets. It was not proof, not yet, but it was enough to keep me awake long after everyone else had gone home. I stared at the ceiling, my heart racing with questions I couldn't voice, because to give them shape would mean admitting that my perfect life might not be so perfect after all. And as the hours stretched on, I knew deep down that once you hear the first crack in a structure, you can't unhear it. You start listening for the next. The days after that dinner gathering stretched on like a shadow I couldn't shake. Nothing had been said outright, nothing caught in words or actions that anyone else would have noticed. But my mind replayed the sight of Mark leaning toward Tessa. It was in the way her hand rested a little too long near his, and how he looked down at her with that quick flash of a smile. that had once been mine alone. I tried to brush it aside, but the more I tried, the heavier it pressed on me. At breakfast, 2 mornings later, I watched him from across the kitchen island. He was scrolling through his phone, sipping coffee, his face half lit by the early sun. When I asked if he was still planning to be at Lily's college prep night, he barely looked up, muttered something about another late meeting with clients, and slipped the phone into his pocket. I wanted to believe him, but I also noticed how quickly he angled the screen away when I leaned closer to put my mug in the sink. Tessa's name began appearing more often, first in small ways I might have ignored, if not for what I had seen that night. A quick call during dinner, her voice lilting through the speaker before he excused himself to the porch. A message that lit up his phone late one evening while we were watching a movie together, the glow vanishing as he set the phone face down on the coffee table. He offered easy explanations, ones that sounded reasonable if I didn't think too hard. She was helping him coordinate a client gala. She was recommending venues for a conference. But when I asked why she was calling after 10 at night, his jaw tightened, and the silence that followed was louder than any answer. I didn't confide in anyone at first. My daughter didn't need that kind of worry pressed onto her young shoulders, and Walter, bless him, adored Mark too much to imagine his son straying. So I carried the weight quietly, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than my imagination, that I was weaving suspicion out of ordinary threads. But I also began to notice how Mark had grown sharper in his words, quicker to irritation. If I asked a second question about his schedule, he would sigh and tell me I was smothering him. If I reminded him about Lily's deadlines, he would mutter that he didn't need another boss at home. The warmth that had once filled our house began to feel fragile, like a candle flickering in a draft. One Saturday, I stopped by the grocery store after work and spotted Tessa near the bakery aisle. She was dressed casually, her cart half full, but it was the sight of Mark's jacket draped over her arm that froze me in place. She noticed me before I could turn away. "Oh, Elena," she said brightly. A little too brightly. "Mark left this at the venue last night. I was just bringing it back to him later." Her smile was smooth, practiced, but I caught the way her eyes darted the slightest stumble in her voice before she smoothed it over. I nodded, forcing a polite smile, but my chest burned all the way home. That evening, when I asked Mark about it, he waved me off. She must have grabbed it by mistake, he said, his tone clipped, as if the question itself was an annoyance. I studied his face, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way he refused to meet my eyes, and I knew. I didn't have proof, not the kind that could be held up in front of anyone else, but I knew the ground beneath my marriage was shifting. The house felt different after that. I found myself listening for his footsteps, for the way his key turned in the lock, for any sign that he was where he claimed to be. Nights grew longer with him out, and when he did come home, there was a faint scent clinging to him that wasn't mine, something floral and sharp that lingered on his shirt. He would peel it off and toss it in the laundry basket before I could say a word. Lily began to notice the tension. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with a pile of papers from school, she slipped into the chair beside me. "Mom, are you and Dad okay?" she asked softly, her eyes wide with worry. I forced a smile, told her everything was fine, just stress from work. But inside, my heart ached at the thought of my daughter, sensing what I was still trying not to admit aloud. I kept remembering the small signs, the kind you want to ignore because admitting them feels like tearing apart your own life. The laughter behind closed doors when he took a call outside. The sudden defensiveness when I reached for his phone one evening to look up a recipe. "Can't I have any privacy?" he snapped too quickly, too harshly for such a simple request. My stomach tightened, but I swallowed the words I wanted to throw back. The cracks in our perfect life were no longer invisible. They ran beneath every conversation, every quiet dinner, every glance across the table that didn't linger as it once had. I wanted to believe that patience could hold us together, that if I gave him space, the warmth would return. But deep down, I sensed that something had already shifted. It was a silence that grew louder each day, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke wide open. Nights grew long and heavy, each one pressing on me like a weight I couldn't put down. I would lie awake in the dark listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, while the space beside me felt colder than it once had. Mark came home later, and later always, with some tidy excuse ready, but I stopped asking for details. It wasn't the words I no longer trusted. It was the way he delivered them, eyes sliding past mine, shoulders tightening before he spoke, as though bracing for a storm that never came. Some evenings, I found myself sitting alone at the dining table long after Lily had gone upstairs, staring at the flicker of candles I had lit out of habit. The house we had built together no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage set, all the right pieces in place, but the warmth missing from behind the walls. I poured myself glasses of wine I barely touched, listening to the tick of the clock and wondering how much longer I could pretend not to notice. The hardest moments came with Lily. She sensed the change without needing words. One night, she lingered in the doorway of my bedroom, her hair damp from a shower, holding her phone loosely in one hand. "Mom," she whispered, "is Dad mad at you?" The innocence in her voice cut deep. I pulled her close, telling her that sometimes grown-ups carried worries from work into the house, that it wasn't about us. She nodded slowly, but I knew she didn't believe me. Children feel the silence between parents in ways even adults can't explain. Even Walter began to notice. He stopped by one Saturday to drop off tools Mark had borrowed, and we stood in the garage talking, as Mark was still at work. "You look tired, Elena," he said gently, his weathered hands resting on the box he carried. I smiled, deflecting, but his eyes studied me carefully. Walter had raised a son who thrived on charm and appearances, but he himself had always been a man of quiet truths. "If something's weighing you down, don't keep it all to yourself," he added before climbing back into his truck. I thanked him, but I couldn't bring myself to speak more. The words would have broken something I still wasn't ready to face. It wasn't only suspicion anymore. It was the toll of carrying it alone and in silence. I found myself crying in small, hidden moments while folding laundry, while waiting in the carpool line at school, while stirring soup that no one else would eat because Mark called to say he had already eaten with clients. The tears came without sound, slipping down my cheeks until I wiped them away quickly, ashamed of my own weakness. I never let Lily see, and when Mark was home, I wore a steady mask, but inside, I was unraveling thread by thread. The smallest things became triggers. A faint trace of perfume on his collar, not mine, lingered in the laundry basket. A dinner receipt I found in his jacket pocket for a restaurant I knew he had never taken me to, tucked beneath a crumpled napkin. He dismissed them when I asked, laughed once, even as though I were being dramatic. But the laughter stung more than any denial, because it told me how little he respected the quiet unease eating me alive. I tried writing in a journal, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. Late at night, with the house dark and still, I would fill page after page with questions I couldn't voice. Why wasn't I enough anymore? When had his gaze shifted away from me? Was it truly Tessa, or was she only a symptom of something that had been breaking for years? The pages blurred with ink where my tears fell, but I kept writing, hoping that somehow putting it down in words would ease the ache in my chest. There were days I caught myself studying Tessa differently too. At school events or community meetings, I would notice how carefully she dressed, how her laughter filled a room, how she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she was admired. I wondered if she looked at me with pity, or worse, with triumph. She never said anything out of place, never gave me proof, but sometimes her glances lingered a second too long when Mark spoke, and that was enough to make me retreat into myself. The silence between Mark and me grew into a wall. He no longer reached for my hand in public, no longer kissed my forehead absent-mindedly as he once had. When he was home, he scrolled endlessly on his phone, turning the screen away each time I walked past. I told myself that asking again would only invite another argument, and I no longer had the strength to fight. So I said nothing, carried the doubt quietly, and smiled through gatherings as though nothing were wrong. But inside, I knew I was changing. The woman who once held her family steady, who believed patience and kindness could bridge any gap, now felt hollowed out by secrets she couldn't name aloud. The house was filled with silence, but inside, my chest was a storm no one could hear. I didn't know when or how, but I knew the truth would come, and when it did, nothing in our lives would look the same again. It happened on a Thursday evening in early spring, when the air still held a chill, but the trees had begun to swell with new buds. Mark had claimed another late dinner with clients, and Lily was at a study session for her AP exams. The house was unusually quiet, and I wandered through the rooms, straightening things that didn't need straightening anything to keep myself from sinking into the weight of suspicion. That's when I noticed his laptop left open on the kitchen counter, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. I had never gone through his things before, never felt the need, but my hands moved almost of their own accord. At first, it was nothing unusual. Emails about quarterly targets, schedules for upcoming conferences, messages to coworkers. Then a name appeared, tucked among the threads, and my heart stumbled. It was hers. Tessa. I clicked once, then again, and the words filled the screen like an echo of the doubts that had been gnawing at me. There was no mistaking the intimacy in their exchanges. They joked about inside moments I had never shared, whispered complaints about spouses and obligations, made plans under the disguise of professional meetings. One line froze me in place. Last night was perfect. I don't know how much longer we can hide this. The blood rushed to my ears, and I gripped the counter to steady myself, the cold marble grounding me against the shock. I don't know how long I stood there staring at those messages, but when the sound of Lily's car pulling into the driveway broke the silence, I shut the laptop quickly and turned off the light. My hands still trembled as I hugged her goodnight, but I kept my face steady. She didn't need to know, not yet. She deserved the safety of innocence for as long as I could protect it. That night, I lay in bed beside an empty space, waiting for Mark to return. He slipped in after midnight, the scent of cologne clinging too strong to be casual. I watched him undress in the dark, his movements unhurried, as though nothing in his world had shifted. I kept my breathing slow and steady, pretending to sleep, but inside, something was hardening. The doubt that had tormented me for months was gone, replaced by a sharp clarity that cut straight through my chest. The next morning, I drove Lily to school and sat in the car long after she had gone inside. The parking lot emptied around me while I stared at the steering wheel, weighing the pieces of my life in silence. I had been raised to keep peace, to endure, to hold families together, even when it meant swallowing my own hurt. But staring at that wheel, I realized there was a limit, a line I could no longer cross without losing myself. I began to watch more closely. I noted the nights he stayed late, the sudden weekend errands that pulled him away for hours, the texts that arrived with a faint smile he didn't bother to hide. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I gathered it quietly, piece by piece, like laying out a puzzle only I could see. The receipts, the faint perfume, the excuses that tripped over one another. It all formed a picture too clear to deny. Even Tessa's presence shifted. At gatherings, she no longer looked at me directly, though her laughter still rang easily in Mark's direction. I noticed the way she avoided my eyes, how quickly she changed the subject if I drifted near. It was a kind of silent confession, one that burned hotter than any words could. I smiled politely, played the role expected of me, but inside, My patience was unraveling. Walter stopped by again one weekend, catching me in the garden while I trimmed back the roses. He asked gently if Mark had been working too hard, said he seemed distracted lately. I forced a smile, deflecting with a comment about the busy season. He studied me with those weathered eyes, as though he sensed more than I wanted him to. When he left, I stood among the roses, the clippings scattered at my feet, and realized how exhausting it was to keep up the mask. The loneliness deepened in those weeks. I cried less, but only because the tears had turned into something else, something colder and sharper. My heart no longer ached with confusion. It pulsed with a new determination. I was done doubting myself, done excusing his distance. The truth was already in my hands, and though I hadn't yet decided how to use it, I knew I would not stay silent much longer. One evening, while Lily studied upstairs, I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the glow of his laptop again. I didn't open it this time. I didn't need to. The proof was no longer hidden. It lived in every look, every lie, every word unsaid. And as I switched off the light and climbed the stairs, one thought followed me into the quiet. The time for patience was over. The truth was no longer something I feared. It was something I would face. And I knew with a certainty that steadied me that once I did, nothing would ever return to the way it had been. The weekend after I found the messages, I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen, staring at a blank page. My hand hovered, then lowered, and I began to write everything I knew. Dates when Mark had been absent, excuses he had given, receipts I had tucked away. Each line steadied me. The facts no longer lived only in my head. They became tangible, something I could look at without doubting my memory. I didn't rush. Each evening after Lily went to bed, I opened a folder in the drawer of my desk and placed another piece of proof inside. A receipt from a restaurant I knew they had visited together. A text notification I had glimpsed before. Mark turned his phone over a canceled credit card statement, showing charges that didn't match his stories. Slowly, carefully, I built a record. I wasn't planning to expose them yet. My steps were quiet, deliberate. I knew that once truth surfaced, there would be no going back. So I gathered it all in silence, pretending to play the part of the steady wife while setting the stage for something different. Even Walter noticed me becoming more reserved, though he mistook it for exhaustion. "You need to take time for yourself, Elena," he said gently one afternoon, stopping by after picking up lumber. I thanked him, nodded, and returned to my desk as soon as he left. The shift in me must have reached Mark because he began to test the edges of my patience. He stayed out later, grew careless with explanations, and even brought Tessa's name into conversation with a casual ease that was meant to sound natural. "She's been a big help with this client gala," he said one night, pouring himself a drink. I only smiled and stirred the pot of soup on the stove. Inside, I was memorizing every word. My first quiet move came during one of those galas. Mark had insisted it was a networking event, the kind of gathering that boosted his standing at the company, and I agreed to attend. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy dress that felt elegant but not showy, and I watched him as he worked the room. He laughed, clapped backs, shook hands with practiced charm. And then I saw her slipping through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes in her hands. Not as staff, but greeting guests with the familiarity of someone who belonged. Tessa glowing her eyes, finding Mark's with an ease that told me what no message could. I didn't approach them. Instead, I found Harold Kim, the chairman of an education nonprofit Mark's company often sponsored. He had known me for years through school events, always greeting me with kindness. We spoke easily about Lily's college plans, about the district's new curriculum, while I kept one eye on Mark and Tessa. At one point, Harold followed my gaze, and his brow furrowed ever so slightly. He didn't ask, but his silence carried weight. Seeds of doubt planted themselves where I needed them most, outside of my own mind, in the perception of others. When we returned home that night, Mark was unusually quiet. He poured another drink and disappeared into his office, leaving me to slip out of my dress and hang it carefully in the closet. As I stood in the darkened room, the fabric cool beneath my fingers, I realized I no longer felt powerless. I had begun to turn their secrecy against them. The weeks that followed carried the same routine, but I no longer allowed his evasions to cut me. Instead, I used them. I asked careful questions about where he would be noting his hesitation, comparing it later to the timestamps of Tessa's social posts or the charges on our accounts. The lies lined up too neatly. Where once they pierced me now, they formed a pattern I could trace with steady hands. Even Lily noticed I was calmer. "You seem less tired lately," she said one evening as we folded laundry together. I kissed her forehead, telling her I had found a new balance at work. She smiled relieved and returned to chatting about her upcoming exams. She didn't need to know that the calm came not from peace, but from preparation. One afternoon, as I was leaving school, I spotted Tessa's car in the parking lot across the street. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She was simply sitting there, her phone in her hand, eyes fixed on the building. I walked to my car, slowly feeling her gaze follow me, but she didn't wave. She didn't smile. The silence between us had thickened into something undeniable. I drove away with my hands steady on the wheel, reminding myself that stillness could be a form of strength. By the time spring gave way to summer, my folder of proof had grown thick. Receipts, notes, screenshots, observations all lined up neatly. I locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk, the key hidden where only I would find it. I didn't open it often, but knowing it was there gave me a strange kind of comfort. Mark had no idea. He carried on with his late nights, his quick glances at his phone, his excuses spoken with less conviction than before. I let him. I smiled when he offered half-truths, nodded when he claimed exhaustion, kissed his cheek lightly when he left for another meeting. The mask had become easy to wear because I knew it would not be needed forever. And in the quiet of those evenings, when Lily studied upstairs and the house hummed with stillness, I began to plan. Not loud, reckless revenge, but something quieter. A steady unraveling of the story he thought he controlled. I knew I would not strike first in anger. I would wait until the right moment, until the foundation beneath him had thinned enough that the truth would collapse it with little effort from me. The hardest part was patience, but I carried it like a shield. Each day I endured was another day closer to the shift I could already feel coming. And when it arrived, when silence broke into confrontation, I would not be the one left trembling. The moment arrived sooner than I expected. It was Walter's retirement gathering held at the Whitmore Grand downtown, a place with high ceilings and chandeliers that cast light like warm water over every polished surface. Mark had been buzzing for weeks, treating the event as much his own stage as his father's farewell. Tessa, of course, was everywhere that night, greeting guests, adjusting centerpieces, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom. I had known she would be there, and I had prepared myself, but it still cut when I saw the way her hand brushed his shoulder as she leaned in to whisper something. I kept my place near the edge of the room, greeting colleagues and neighbors with a practiced smile. But my eyes never lost sight of the pair of them. Mark was in his element glass, raised laughter spilling as he told stories that drew nods of admiration. Tessa mirrored him, leaning close, laughing at every word, her gaze resting on him longer than propriety allowed. I had lived with shadows and suspicions for months, But that night, under those chandeliers, the truth was no longer hidden. It was displayed in plain sight for anyone willing to look. Walter had asked me earlier to say a few words, and I rose when called, steadying my hands on the microphone. I spoke of his years building homes with care and precision, of the lessons he passed on to his students and neighbors. My voice was calm, but beneath the words I felt Mark's eyes on me, searching, measuring. When I glanced toward Tessa, she quickly lowered her gaze to the linen tablecloth. That fleeting shift was enough to confirm what I already knew. Later in the evening, Harold Kim approached me with a glass of sparkling water in his hand. "You handled that beautifully," he said softly, nodding toward the podium. His gaze flicked past me, settling on Mark and Tessa as they stood in quiet conversation near the bar. Harold's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing more. His silence told me he had seen what I had hoped others might begin to notice, that lines had been crossed, and not discreetly. As the night wore on, I drifted outside for air, needing a moment away from the hum of voices. The terrace overlooked the city, the lights stretching out like a river of stars. Mark followed, not long after, his jacket slung carelessly over one shoulder, the scent of whiskey clinging to him. "You've been quiet tonight," he remarked, leaning against the railing beside me. His tone was light, but I caught the edge beneath it, a question unspoken. "I had plenty to say," I replied evenly, and I said it. My eyes stayed on the skyline, not on him. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of laughter drifting through the terrace doors. I felt him shift, restless, but he didn't press further. That silence carried more weight than any argument could. When we returned home later, I didn't confront him. Instead, I waited until he disappeared into his office and slipped into our bedroom. I opened the drawer of my desk, pulling out the folder I had kept hidden for weeks. I laid the receipts, messages, and notes across the bedspread, each one a piece of a story that no longer needed my imagination to complete. I looked at them not as a woman breaking, but as someone gathering strength. This was no longer about doubt or confusion. It was about preparing for the moment when lies would no longer shield him. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the faint tap of keys from his office, I realized I had crossed a threshold. The fear that had once kept me silent was gone, replaced by a steadiness that surprised even me. He had chosen his path openly now, without shame or caution, and I would no longer look away. The days that followed felt different. I carried myself with a calmness Mark didn't quite know how to read. He asked fewer questions, gave fewer explanations, and I answered him with simple nods, letting the silence work in ways words could not. Even Lily sensed the shift, though she only smiled more easily when I asked about her classes, relieved perhaps to see me less burdened than before. Tessa called one evening, her number flashing across the screen. I let it ring, then fall silent, my hand steady on the counter. She did not leave a message, but she didn't need to. I knew she understood the change as well as I did. The breaking point was no longer something I dreaded. It was something I welcomed, something I was quietly shaping with each piece of truth I carried. When it came, and I knew it would not be me standing in the shadow. It would be him. The unraveling came faster than I expected. It began with whispers after Walter's retirement gala, murmurs that carried across our circle of friends and colleagues. A neighbor mentioned seeing Mark and Tessa leaving the hotel together late that night, and though she tried to soften it, her eyes held apology. Soon after, Harold called, his voice measured. "Elena," he said, "I don't want to meddle, but people are talking. It may be wise to protect yourself." The words settled over me with a finality I had been preparing for. I didn't rush into a storm of accusations. Instead, I let the pieces fall on their own. When Mark stumbled through the door one evening, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot, I asked calmly, "Was it another late dinner?" He nodded quickly, too quickly, then slipped past me toward the stairs. The faint trace of perfume trailed behind him. Not mine, not hidden. For the first time, I didn't swallow my questions. I let them hang in the air, thick and undeniable, until his footsteps faded. By the end of that week, the silence around us had cracked. A friend of Lily's mother called, concerned, saying she had overheard Tessa bragging about finally getting what she deserved. I thanked her quietly, my voice steady, though my hands tightened around the phone. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was exposure. The lies had slipped into daylight where they could no longer be controlled. I chose my moment carefully. Sunday dinner had always been a tradition in Walter's family, a gathering of 3 generations around the same table. That evening, the house filled with the familiar smell of roast and fresh bread. Walter sat at the head, his hands folded, Lily chattering beside him. Mark and Tessa arrived together, a choice bold enough to confirm everything before a word was spoken. She carried a dessert dish as though she belonged, her smile tight, her eyes darting quickly in my direction. I waited until after the meal, until plates were pushed back and the room was soft with conversation. Then I stood, smoothing the fabric of my dress with calm hands, and laid the folder on the table. There are things that need to be said. I began, my voice clear but not raised. Mark shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. Tessa's hand froze on her glass. One by one, I laid out the pieces, the receipts, the messages, the photographs that lined up his meetings with her outings. I didn't embellish, didn't accuse. I presented them plainly, each one a stone in the foundation of truth. The room grew quiet, the air heavy. Lily's face paled as she looked from her father to the pages spread before her. Walter's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. Mark tried to speak, stumbling through half-formed denials, but each word fell flat against the evidence. Tessa opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting toward the door as though calculating an escape. No one moved. The silence was its own judgment. Finally, Walter's voice broke through low and sharp. "You've disgraced this family, Mark." The words struck harder than any shout. For years, Mark had thrived on charm, on the belief that he could weave his way out of any corner. That night, stripped of his lies, he sat hollow, staring at the papers with a face drained of color. Tessa reached for his arm, but he pulled away, the gesture reflexive, as though even he recognized the cost of her presence. I gathered the pages quietly, sliding them back into the folder, and looked at Walter. "I'll be filing for separation," I said simply. He nodded once, his eyes heavy with grief, but steady with approval. Lily leaned into me, her small hand finding mine under the table, and I held it tightly. Tessa excused herself first, muttering something about needing air, her footsteps sharp against the hardwood as she left. Mark remained seated, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, no longer meeting anyone's gaze. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. The truth was no longer mine to carry alone. It belonged to everyone who needed to see it. When we left that evening, Walter hugged me tightly, his voice low in my ear. "You did what had to be done," he said. I nodded against his shoulder, tears pressing behind my eyes, but not falling. They weren't tears of grief anymore. They were something closer to release. The days that followed were filled with calls and messages, people who had heard, people who had already suspected. I didn't answer most of them. I focused on Lily, on the steadiness of our routines, on reclaiming the quiet of my own home. Mark moved into a hotel, his absence, a hollow space that no longer ached the way it once had. Justice hadn't come with shouting or revenge. It had come with truth laid bare where it could no longer be denied. And as I folded laundry in the quiet of my living room, I understood that his world, the one built on charmed secrecy and borrowed trust, was already crumbling around him. And I knew as I tucked the last shirt neatly into the basket that this was only the beginning of his fall. The rest would come steady and certain without me needing to lift another finger. Walter's words stayed with me after that dinner, the quiet strength in his voice, reminding me that standing firm wasn't cruelty, it was survival. In the days that followed, I moved through the house differently. The air felt lighter, no longer thick with doubt, no longer carrying the weight of secrets pressed into every corner. For the first time in years, I could set the table, fold laundry, or water the plants without wondering where Mark was or what lies he might bring home. Mark remained in the hotel for a while, though word traveled quickly that Tessa had slipped away. She didn't call, didn't try to explain, and I suppose she realized that being tied to his downfall wasn't the victory she had imagined. His colleagues grew distant, invitations stopped coming, and even the easy charm he had once used to win people over seemed to falter without a stage to perform on. Watching from a distance, I saw not triumph, but the natural collapse of a man who built too much on borrowed trust. Lily grew quieter in those first weeks, but with time, she began to blossom again. She studied late at the kitchen table, music humming faintly from her laptop, her shoulders finally at ease. One night, she looked up at me and said, "I'm glad it's just us now, Mom. The house feels safe again." Her words nearly undid me, but I only reached across the table and squeezed her hand, knowing she had carried more than she ever should have. Walter remained steady in our lives, showing up with small repairs to keep himself busy, sharing dinner at least once a week. He never spoke harshly about his son again, but there was a weariness in his eyes, as though he was mourning not only the betrayal, but the years lost to covering it. Sometimes I caught him watching Lily with pride, perhaps finding comfort in the pieces of family that remained solid when everything else had fractured. For me, healing came in small moments, waking up to a quiet morning without dread. Walking through the garden with the sun warming my face, knowing I no longer had to brace for shadows. Sitting at the same table where the truth had been laid bare, but this time filling it with laughter and conversations that held no hidden edges. Each day stitched back a little of the dignity that had been unraveled thread by thread. Looking back, I don't regret the patience I carried, though it nearly broke me. That silence gave me time to gather strength to face the truth with steadiness instead of anger. When the moment came, I didn't need to shout or strike out. I only needed to show what was already there. Justice, in its truest form, isn't about destroying someone else. It's about reclaiming the space they tried to take from you. Mark's fall was his own doing. Tessa's absence proved her loyalty was as fleeting as the perfume that clung to his shirts. And in the end, I didn't need to punish either of them. Their choices spoke louder than anything I could have said. What mattered was that Lily and I were free from the web they had spun, and that freedom carried more peace than revenge ever could. If there's one lesson I carry from this chapter of my life, it is this: silence can be strength when it is chosen, but dignity must never be sacrificed to keep the peace. There comes a moment when facing the truth is the only way to protect what matters. For me, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing tall again with my daughter beside me in a home that finally felt like ours. Before we close, I'd love to know, have you ever had a moment where staying quiet turned into your greatest strength? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.